Hello everyone. My name's Tim Wall. I'm one of the university staff, so I wanted to start by welcoming you to Birmingham and to Birmingham City University in the Parkside building. We're particularly proud to be hosting the conference, the Unconference, here today. We think it's a really important part of what we do as a university is to gauge the outside world. We're certainly not a university who considers we inhabit an ivory tower. And I'd like also to welcome you to the event and its host, the Birmingham Centre for Media and Cultural Research, of which I'm very proud to be the director. Media for Social Change is a really important part of the work that we do. We believe strongly that the media aren't just for entertainment or to make money for major corporations. And we're absolutely delighted that you can all come here for a day of debate and discussion and learning, and that maybe in some small way will contribute to changing the world. I'd also like to thank Dr. Dima Saber. Many people have worked hard on the event, but Dima really has been the driving force, and she's been a bit of an inspiration for the rest of us because she's been doing this for most of the time with a broken shoulder. So if you can put an Unconference on with a broken shoulder, you could probably shift the world on its axis a little bit as well. So welcome to you, and now I'll pass on to Dima with thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay, welcome everybody. I'm going to be very fast. How many, just to get an idea, how many of you have been to an Unconference before? Raise your hands. Okay. So a few of you know how the day would go. I'm just going to tell you just in 2 minutes what you should be expecting from this day, and then I'm going to give time to our panelists to introduce themselves, and then hopefully start taking questions. So basically the idea of this is we wanted to get people into a very unconventional, informal setting. We're going to just start with this panel. It's going to go until 12 only, and then over lunch, so lunch goes from 12 to 1. And over lunch, you're going to see outside that there's a whiteboard that's divided in sections. And this is where probably is the most important part of what you guys hopefully would be doing today, is to each one is invited to suggest sessions, things that you're interested in, things that you're working in, things you're passionate about, things you've got questions about. Is basically put up your name with the title of the session. How you see the board is going, now it's filled up a little bit because that was early this morning. But basically, we've got spaces for sessions and time slots. Every session would go for 45 minutes. So the moment you're interested and needed the session, and we're going to be pushing you over lunch to do that, suggest the sessions and then start gathering people around. You're going to see on the U-shape in the open space on the right of the board, you're going to see there's signs for rooms. So look for A, B, C, D, E, basically, on the wall to find the room where your session is supposed to be held. Basically, for those of you, again, who's this first time you make it to an Unconference is a very, very informal and free event. So basically, it's up to the participant to make the worst or the best of the event. There's only 4 rules that people agree to, putting them as rules to Unconferences. So basically, you are the best people who could have been here. We're going to start it when we're going to start, which is now. We're ending when you guys decide we're ending. But actually, the most important part for me is this rule that we call the rule of the 2 feet. So it says that if any point in your day you feel yourself in a place where you're neither learning nor contributing to discussions, just use your feet to go somewhere else. So the idea from this is that for each person leading sessions, it's completely normal for people to come in and out of sessions. The whole idea of the Unconference and it happening in an open space is that people are free to go from one place to another, to meet the maximum people they can meet, and to basically have the best discussions they could be having together. So these are our 4 rules, and basically these are the only really rules that apply. The sessions would go from 1 till 4, and then we'll get together at 4. Dave just suggested that since the weather is so nice, maybe we can get together and do the wrap-up session outside. We'll see how technically that would happen, how much Brett and Chris up there would want to kill me, but I think that's a good idea to explore. The one thing I want to is there one or two volunteers who would like to moderate the afternoon session? Because I would like to, not for us to moderate the session. So basically, it's just a wrap-up session that would go from 4 to 5, where people get together, say what they learned, say what they discussed during sessions, and sort of think together of where do we go from here. So if there are volunteers, please come speak to me, either after the panel or over lunch. Happy for you to take lead on the moderation. This applies as well to our panelists. Okay, unless there's any specific questions that anybody wants to ask about the day and how the day would go, we'll start with our speakers' introductions. So basically, what I wanted to start with is that one of the key people who's supposed to be on the panel with us, his name is Rami Farah. He's the director of a Syrian movie documentary that we're working on with Sine and Liana. They're both going to be here and speak. But we got we submitted for a visa application from the UK Border Agency twice. And first time it was rejected, and the second time we haven't heard. And so he's in Paris, and he'll be joining us on Skype. But just in case you guys were wondering what the UK Border Agency Twitter handle, it's this one. Because, yes. So at a time where, we try to present this alternative, non-violent, dialogue, openness, positivity, making a documentary about war and having to deal with all of that. And instead of being in a place, we are in a place that seems to be wanting to foster creativity and innovation and openness and inspiration. But unfortunately, these people don't seem to want to help us do that. So shout out on Twitter. That's a good way to go around it. So what I want to suggest we do first is, so are we starting with a trailer or with Rami? Sorry. So this is Rami, but he will join us in a bit.
Marhaba, my name is Rami Farah. I'm Syrian filmmaker. I'm based in Paris. 7 months ago, a friend of mine fled Syria on his feet crossing the Syrian-Jordanian borders with only one thing in his hand, a hard disk full of stories. The story of the images and videos which he filmed with his teams since the Arab Spring waves reached Syria.
26 شباط 2011 اعتقل مجموعة أطفال من مدرسة ابتدائية بجنوب سوريا بدرعا بتهمة الكتابة على جدران المدارس الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام. 18 آذار 2011 مظاهرة من أهالي الطلاب عم يطالبوا بالإفراج عن أطفالهم. هي المظاهرة كانت بالجامع الأول. هذا اليوم مات فيه أول شهيدين مسكونين. 19 آذار 2011 تم تشييع الشهيدين الأوائل إلى مقبرة الشهداء. صرخ المشيعين ثورة ثورة ثورة.
مين نحن أنا وولي محمود كل حدا عنده شخص ما عاد ساكن مع أهله أو مع زوجته مفرغ بالكامل كل حياته ليصور ويغطي أحداث المكان واللقاءات اللي تصير فيه. فبالتالي هو مستحق إنه يروى. بالبداية كان نشاط فردي، كل شخص بيصور لحاله، بيحاول يرسل لحاله، بيفتح قنوات معينة إعلام لحتى يوصل له المواد اللي عم يصورها كأثناء البدائل، يعني رد على ما يبث بالإعلام السوري. يعني بكل مظاهرة في شخص بيكون مسؤول ميداني عن تنظيم المظاهرة وعن إنه يعني كإدارة المظاهرة. في حدا شغلته يصور ويبث على الإنترنت بشكل مباشر. في حدا شغلته يصور الفيديوهات فقط والصور فوتوغراف. في حدا شغلته يكتب اللافتات. يعني هو نحن دائما فريق. ما عملنا شيء يدعم الشعب أو روينا إنه إخواني، بس روايتنا كانت غير مؤثرة بأي حدا عم يشوفها أو يسمع.
Okay, I'm gonna leave the floor over Skype to Rami, who's gonna just introduce himself, and then we'll start with the other panels. Mike is yours.
Hi everyone, I'm sorry I'm not there. I tried my best, but I couldn't make it. Thank you everyone to be there. I'm still believing that we are together. I hope that we can pass this day in positive energy and we can do something really for a lot of people that they need us. I don't want to take a lot of time. Maybe later on afternoon, I will be in one of the rooms on the Skype. So anyone, if you want to have conversation about the movie, about the footage of the citizen journalist around the world, or even in Syria for sure, I would love to, please. Just pass to the room where I will be, on the Skype. Thank you all.
Okay. Thanks. We're gonna keep you here, but I'm gonna put the Twitter poll up. Liana.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Tim. Thank you, Dima, for bringing us here. My name is Liana Saleh. I'm a Palestinian journalist based in France. I work for France 24. I also work in films, and I'm collaborating with Rami on this project, which is a cross-media project called On Screen Off Record. And it's basically composed of four different items: a documentary, a web documentary, and later on a comic book and an e-learning resource that we were developing with Birmingham City University and the Research Center. So yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, let's get
So I introduced myself before. I tweet as Prof of Pop because I'm actually Professor of Radio and Popular Music, so my interests in the media started there, but I felt that I was quite heavily involved in community radio, and particularly in understanding how popular music built communities. And of course, with the new technologies in music, it was a really important and agent for change. And I became particularly interested in how those technologies would possibly not only change music, but change the world. And we made that a really important part of what we did as a research centre. And one of the most fortunate things that happened is we managed to appoint Dima, who's been so energetic about developing our work. But that had started some time before in a partnership with Meedan, who you'll hear about in a little bit. And I write about Northern Soul as well, which is a very strange community in British society, which I'll explain to you later if you'd like to know more. And the revolution will not be televised.
Great. Thanks, Tim. So my name is Ed Bice, and I work at Meedan. I want to first thank Dima and Tim and BCU team for putting on this event, and Noha for bringing us to BCU many years ago, and George, former colleague, Tom, current colleague, for making these important connections happen. So Meedan is sort of the Unconference of organizations. We are globally distributed, highly creative, idealistic team of individuals in Cairo, in Lebanon, in San Francisco, Vancouver, and a bunch of other countries around the world, working to create the tools that empower activists and citizen journalists to create media for social change. Our project would not be the project it is without our BCU partnership. BCU has been incredible as a research partner, developing resources, learning resources for citizen journalists for us, and also doing some really high-level work on innovative M&E strategies, the monitoring and evaluation, which is part of making these projects successful. So we've been running our citizen media project as Checkdesk. You'll hear more about Checkdesk today. We'll have a session on Checkdesk, but in a brief few words, Checkdesk is a platform that enables citizen journalists to do fact-checking on top of social media. So when a YouTube video comes out of Syria, what prevents a mainstream media source from putting that into their reporting? Well, it's usually the fact that they don't know who published it, where it came from. We've created a sort of clever web application that allows collaboration on top of that work of doing verification. So it's an important piece of bridging citizen journalism into mainstream journalism, bridging citizen voices into kind of meaningful impact. So we'll talk some more about that, but I'm really thrilled to be here and grateful to Tim and Dina and Noha for their hospitality and partnership.
Sorry, there was supposed to be a video going on there, which actually tells you what Checkdesk is. Maybe can we put voice audio on this, since we haven't seen it? Then people will actually know what Checkdesk is.
Asking a lot of the AV guy.
Or we're gonna, yeah, I was supposed to run before Ed, but I mean, all of this was also part of doing an Unconference. So we'll be showing this at the session.
Great.
So if you guys are interested in knowing more about Checkdesk, what it does, how it works, there's going to be a room dedicated for a Checkdesk afternoon session. So please join Ed and Tom there.
Great.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Signe Bjørge Sørensen, and I'm an independent filmmaker from Copenhagen, Denmark, from a place called Final Cut for Real. It's a small company. And I also want to thank Dima and Tim and everyone for organizing this. It's very, very interesting for us coming from outside of the university environment. I'm here because I'm working with Rami and Liana on this film from Syria. We do documentaries in Final Cut. That's our main purpose. But all the films we do, we want them to have both a strong artistic vision, but also a political context and a political vision. And so we are very much engaged. Our main focus is producing the films. That's what we do. That's what we're good at. But we also want the films to get out there, and we try to do our best to distribute them both sort of in traditional channels like television and cinema and video and whatever, but also through outreach programs in the places where we work. And the most recent films we've done before we started working on this one is called The Act of Killing, which has been out here in the UK and is a film that takes place in Indonesia. And we also did a huge outreach program with this film in Indonesia. Not us, but we worked together with the Indonesian crew that were a very, very important part of making the film, and they also were a very important part of getting the film out in Indonesia. Right now we also have a project in Colombia called Democracy, about the Green Wave, which tried to, in 2010 when there was a presidential election, a very special kind of politician called Antanas Mogus ran for president with a kind of a citizen campaign, wanting the citizens to do their own posters, do their own media, do everything themselves, because he wanted to stay out of the very, very corrupt political structures that were already there, because that was what he wanted to change. And we hope to bring that film out sometime later this year. But these are some of the things that we're doing. My other background is, like before I started making documentaries about 15 years ago, I studied international development studies and communication studies, and also with a focus on community media. And one of my main focus areas were the struggle in South Africa for democratic media after the end of the apartheid. So that's my background.
Okay, Michelle.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Michelle Aaron and teach at the University of Birmingham. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a joy to be involved in such an interesting event and very exciting, especially to me, I think, because since I began my academic career, I've been really fascinated by what I guess I'd call difficult images, representations that offer unconscionable and serve up unconscionable images within the mainstream, actually. And I've always been fascinated with how we might understand our relationship as spectators to a popular culture that feeds us images that actually are illegal, criminal, unethical, immoral within our normal everyday life, but actually on the screen we delight in them. And from trying to figure that out, trying to figure out these discussions of spectatorship and what our investment as spectators are, I increasingly was thinking slightly differently about, if we're looking at images of human suffering, both in the mainstream and outside, how again might we understand our roles as spectators, what our political and, more importantly, perhaps ethical relationship is to them. And by ethical, what I mean, I think, and what increasingly I write about, is how these images make us think and feel things that encourage us perhaps to feel they're emotive. They perhaps encourage us to do things, but what is the extent of the doing that they encourage us to do? And part of the ethical discussion is also to think about how these images draw connections between us as spectators and the people who are probably far away and whose stories we are sharing in and whose suffering we are witnessing and perhaps on some level enjoying. And I use that term very reservedly, but in many ways these images are often served up for our enjoyment and for what we might call our betterment, our ability perhaps to feel better about ourselves, about our relationship to terrible things, our relationship to suffering in other countries. So it's all part of a big mix of things that we might think of in terms of ethics. Increasingly, though, I'm particularly invested in moving away from, say, looking at the negativity or the lack of ethics of mainstream film and seeing how one might be, and how we might talk about ethical filmmaking within the process of actually making it. And that, I think, is the greater challenge. And I'm looking at being involved in various research projects with filmmakers and artists and communities, and how we might actually develop and think about filmmaking as being ethical, without forgetting that it's also fulfilling certain needs of the spectator, as well as fulfilling certain needs of the filmmakers and the communities who it's representing. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. We'll get back to the question of ethics during the panel when we speak about post-Arab uprising and world documentaries and film. It's going to be really exciting to hear both yours and Sina's approach and questions of ethics and responsibility in this industry. Raja.
Hi, everybody. My name is Raja Adebani, and I'm from an international human rights organization called Witness. We're based in New York. We do a lot of work globally. I focus on MENA, so a lot of the work that I've been doing in particular has been focused on human rights movements in the Middle East and North Africa, and how people are using video as a tool to capture and document human rights abuses that are happening in people's communities. We train and work with individuals who are filmmakers, who are amateur videographers, citizen journalists. So we work with a wide range of people. We've done work in Egypt, in Yemen, Syria, Bahrain, and so we're learning a lot, we're sharing a lot, we're creating lots of resources, which I'll try to share later during one of the sessions. And I guess that's it for now. You'll hear more from me later.
All right. Thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna start. So Rami is with us. In case anybody has a question for him, you can ask him directly. He's listening, but he's behind the Twitter feed on the screen. But again, there is a booth for the Syrian documentary, and there would be a session happening there. And Rami would be on a Skype computer with actual earphones. So if any of you is interested to know more, to meet the director, speak to Sina, speak to Rami, please also join them in the booth. So the first question I wanted to start with. Basically, as you probably have seen on the Eventbrite and on the wiki that we set up, we didn't pick up themes that we have to restrict ourselves to throughout the day. But one element that brings all of our panelists together and all of you guys together is this idea of citizen reporting and social media. And so I wanted to open this panel by, I don't know how many of you have read this article by Zainab Tufki. She's a associate professor based in the US, a sociologist, but also an activist, has been writing about Arab uprisings, Turkey a lot, has been doing an amazing job doing that. And so she's lately written, a couple of days ago, this article that was published in Medium about two mainstream media journalists, one from The Guardian and the other one from Times, who have written an article about Liza Adams, who's a lady who's diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer. And so this lady has been live tweeting her sickness for the last several months. And the two pieces that came up, I'll direct this, I'll put this on the wiki. But basically, what I wanted to start our panel with is this quotation that I found very interesting, and I would like it to be our opening question together. So basically what the writer does in this article is she says, you can't just go to a Twitter poll or you can't just look at social media as a press release. It's not something that you tap into, you choose the bits that suit your story as mainstream journalists and then make up your own. And what the quotation I'd like to reflect with you on is this one. If anything, social media has helped move us to a world in which people are no longer passive, final subjects of journalists, and what I really like is, or academics or gatekeepers of public discourse, so basically most of the people in this room. We can no longer speak of people at them, without them, talking back of their experience and articulating their own narrative in their own terms. And how to deal with that reality, not whether cancer patients should tweet that much, is the real ethical question before us. So what she's trying to say is, one of the most important things that social media has done is that we can no longer speak of people in their backs, is we need to engage in a discussion, and that social media is a community. And so beyond the actual euphoria that happens around the world, and with a focus on somehow the Middle East, Twitter has made the revolution, Facebook toppled Mubarak, social media is changing the world. So if we take one step back and stop and just reflect, and the first question I would like to open with is, what is social media and what is not? And how should we as filmmakers, academics, professional technologists, thinkers, activists, bloggers, advocates, look at it and analyze it? And the floor is open to you. Anybody would like to pick it up?
I'll start in. So I think it's interesting that we group YouTube videos, Twitter, Facebook posts. We group all of this as social media, and I think the broad, defining thread through that is this is content that's coming from individuals. I think there's a difference with a YouTube video, which is, and this difference is not lessening the importance of videos in the video medium, but I think the really primary and unbelievable kind of change in journalism is a factor of the addressability of individuals, and Zainab is talking about this in her article. The internet was the soil. Twitter, Facebook took the globally distributed internet and created a facility for every one of us to be addressable on that through that platform, and so I think the profound shift is this fact that a journalist a media company doesn't need to have an office in Cairo, doesn't need to send a journalist to Cairo, and in fact shouldn't send a journalist to Cairo, because their journalists should be, they should be speaking the language, and we can talk more about language mediation, but they should be asking questions of people who are in a place during an event. And it's always been a part of journalism. It's always been, you know, the interview with the person who witnessed the fire. But now we have the ability to DM with someone who knows someone who can then put us in touch with the person who's holding the phone and standing in the middle of the square. And these are the profound experiences we've had. This, I think, is it's the addressability of everyone in the world who's connected to the internet through a device. And this is the profound shift.
Well,
Stop talking to me and talk to the people.
No, I think this, in many ways, this whole discussion about social media today is very, you know, it has a long history, and I think we should remember that, because, for example, in filmmaking, a lot of what is said about social media was said about the same things were said when the first video cameras came around, and people could start doing take the cameras out of the studios and film in the streets and so on. And so in a way, it's just the media has become more and more accessible and to many more people, and that's in so many ways with the internet and so on, and that's all fantastic. But it just means that the problem has changed a little bit, because now we can all access with our phones and everything, but then we just end up in this huge ocean of stuff, and we are not necessarily noticed. So we may have the potential to get out there and put a video on YouTube, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the point we're trying to make is getting heard by anyone. So there's still a lot of different levels of media economics, a lot of other things, politics that define who I actually listen to. That's one point I want to make. And then the other one is also that I think that, yes, it's true, the people who are reporting from a certain place should speak the language and know the context and everything. But when you are in a certain place, you also need to know which audience are you actually addressing. And if you are someone who are fighting a demonstration in Tahrir Square in Cairo, you may know a lot about that situation, but you may not know what the audience, for example, in the city where I come from, in Copenhagen, know about this. So you may not be able to actually address them in a way that they understand. And that's why I think that even though we have all these tools available, we still need people both in those places and people in other countries that have to be able to communicate and talk about what is the core of these things. Because, I work with Rami and Liana with this material that Rami told about from this hard disk, and it's fantastic material, and people died for this material, making it. But it's pure documentation. It's people who are filming with their phones in a demonstration, and that's so important. But if you don't get a context, if I don't get Rami and Liana telling me what is all this about, pointing to the different elements in the pictures, explaining when it was taken, explaining the context of what happened in that city over time afterwards, who were these people filming, why were they filming exactly there, then I don't know anything. I don't get any more clever from looking at that demonstration footage. And that's the problem. And it's so, in one way, we have a huge resource, which is all this wonderful documentation taken at the right point, at the right time, at the right place. But at the same time, we need to work together on this context making, because otherwise it will not communicate to the audience that's supposed to see it.
I think this is a really good question because I love using social media, but at the same time I hate it with a passion. Just to add on to what the other panelists have said, I'm going to give you guys an example. We've been working with actually sifting through thousands of videos coming out of Syria. Syria is one of the places in the Middle East and in the world where there is the most footage coming out of any atrocities, of human rights abuses. There's nothing in history that has been so well documented than the conflict in Syria. And I think social media tweeting, using YouTube, all of this, all these platforms are just free spaces for individuals to really just share their stories. And especially just average citizens who are facing human rights abuses or struggling through something. What a victim wants to do, the first thing he or she wants to do is just share their story. It's the first instinct. So to have that kind of free space to do that is really helpful, but at the same time, it still comes from the perspective of one individual. So if we all face the same experience and the same incident that has happened, and we all witness a massacre, and we all upload videos from our different perspectives, these are just little pieces of a story. But what's been fascinating over time is that what we've seen is that there are groups on the ground now filming in teams and trying to get different perspectives and kind of an entire view of what the full story is, through interviews and through filming in different angles, long shots, wide shots, establishing shots, detailed shots, adding narration. And so people are getting more creative as they hit these walls and challenges. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that a lot of these people who are using social media to share their stories are learning from the challenges that they hit. So if they circulate a video that doesn't have enough context, that's really difficult to verify, and it's not being used, they learn. And Syrians, unfortunately, had to learn the hard way in over 2 to 3 years of conflict, or more than 3 years now of conflict. They've had to learn through experience of, okay, if I'm in Homs and I'm filming a demonstration that's being targeted by armed forces, I need to make sure that I'm gonna capture a landmark. I need to make sure that I'm gonna get an establishing shot that shows that this is an unarmed protest, nonviolent. So people are beginning to think strategically, and it's been happening really fast. But at the same time, there still are individuals and thousands of people who are new to this. And there are thousands of videos out there, thousands of tweets out there, more than hundreds of thousands, that are kind of oversaturating sometimes one part of the story, maybe the violent part of the story, the graphic part of the story. And there's still a lack, but what we need to see more of are these other cases of where people are spotlighting an entire story and contextualizing what's really happening.
I mean, lots of really interesting things to be said about this is the kind of ethical democratic medium, and yet also quite partial in how that might occur, and that there's something more ideal perhaps to come. And I just wanted to introduce something slightly different, which was to think that the great shift is, of course, from film as a principal medium, but one that is absolutely entrenched in power dynamics and remains entrenched in power dynamics. And of course, social media still has that relationship to power dynamics. You know, how do images and narratives, especially about others suffering, especially about historical events and atrocities, how do they still remain so rooted in a way in which there is objectification, there's sensationalism, there's a kind of harnessing of emotions for certain ends, for very noble ends, but also for less easily definable ends. So I guess part of that shift is both a break away from the power dynamics, both gendered and racial and national, that are intrinsic to film as a technology and always were from its very earliest origins, but still are relevant to social media.
Anyone who knows me knows that it's going to be about 3 things. And it seems to me it's a set of questions around what is it to be an expert, and what is it to communicate, and what is it to participate. And I think that those are shifted by particular technologies. They're not created or start something that wasn't there. In universities, we think our expertise is the most important thing. But sometimes all that book learning and time spent thinking ignores people's real experience. And so I think to engage in the world of social media is a humbling act in some ways, is to realise that you do have some sorts of expertise, but that you don't possess others. And in terms of questions around communication, really people have always used communication in order to change things. I've been involved with thinking about these things for so long that when we started it was machines that you had to turn handles on in order to print off pieces of paper, or it was using cheaper radio technologies to try and broadcast to smaller communities. And clearly what's altered in communication is the ability to have your community not next door but on the other side of the world, and to connect in different sorts of ways, and for your communities to be of interest, not simply of geography. And I think the other area is that issue of participation, and this university has just spent an enormous amount of money on this building, and built into its whole fabric is this notion that you sit in those seats and people like me, who are the experts, sit in these, and you listen and then you write it down, and somehow you're a better person for that. But participation works differently, and I think, again, the technologies allow us to participate in new and different ways, and each of those are then changed by the other. So nothing actually is fixed, and I find that quite exciting. But none of these are easy solutions. It's very easy to be utopian about this, but people who have expertise usually have power as well, and they don't want participation. And people who want participation often find it very difficult to understand and grasp at issues of power, and think simply to express it is sufficient. But it's actually to change it, I think, that's most important.
Sorry, I'm going to pick up on this, and then so we just take it a little bit further, because there was a lot of things that have been said. And again, at some point, I would like for this, Tim was talking about seats we sit in and you guys are sitting in. The first slide that was supposed to start with was an image of the hall with underneath it, "This is not a lecture hall," because one of the main things that we were, trying to occupy in this university was this hall, is how do we turn it into something that is less conventional, etc. So basically what we're trying to do this is exactly break this relationship. But the question is, whose responsibility? So basically there's all of this content that's going out of the MENA region and the world to document, everybody encourages citizens to take on cameras, document what you see, share your word. We're going to give your social media gives voices to the voiceless, etc. But at the end of the day, whose responsibility is it? And how can we, because we've realized that some of the social media and the misinformation online is causing more harm than good. And Raja brought up Syria, Sine, and Liana. I'm sure you're going to talk about the Syrian example as well. Syria has been really well documented, but Syria is also one of these places where there is the most rumors and the most misinformation. So who is to be held responsible for this content that's put up online? Who are the curators, and whose responsibility? I'd like to hear maybe from Liana first.
Yes. I'd just like to tell you a short anecdote. When Bouazizi burned himself and they made a demonstration in Sidi Bouzid, they filmed it and they sent the video to France 24. And that was the first time actually that we deal with images, with amateur images coming from a place that is sealed from journalists, and we had to do something with it. And we did a report. And France 24 was the first channel to do such a report. And then it all started, a revolution in Tunisia, in Egypt, and then in Libya, and afterwards in Syria and other countries. Social media was used in different ways from one country to another. For example, the Egyptian revolution, the social media was used really like in a pop art way. Its own purpose was to reach out the world. It was very colorful. It was very positive, very beautiful. Syria is a very, very special case because even the quantity, like there are millions of videos that are on YouTube and other social media platforms that are coming from Syria, but still there is a problem with the quality and what are people filming. When people in Dara started pick up their mobile phones in the first day of the revolution, they were overwhelmed by the moment itself, like they were witnessing something that is happening in their lives for the first time, which is a demonstration. People never demonstrated before. So they filmed this for themselves. And later on, when the revolution continued, they kept on filming to document and to witness and to prove wrong what is the Syrian TV is saying. Because whether we want it or not, the Syrian conflict is a media conflict from its first beginning. From day one, the Syrian TV was talking about terrorists, was talking about gangsters, was talking about foreign people coming in the country to bring chaos in it. So people wanted to prove wrong what the Syrian TV is saying. They filmed, they sent these videos via Facebook, via Skype, and here I have a question. Is Skype a social media tool? To mainstream media. And these videos were manipulated also by mainstream media. So even the project that we're working on now is about citizen journalists, how they were trapped between the propaganda of the Syrian TV and the agenda of mainstream, like foreign mainstream media. Because in a way or another, I think we cannot separate social media from mainstream media, because mainstream media gives also a platform or manbar, how do you say that? Platform for social media.
Yes, but I want to go back to whose responsibility, who verifies, who curates, who aggregates, and if we can't answer the question of responsibility, which is directly tied to the question of ethics that you brought up, Michelle, is that this immediately means that us at academics, we should be extremely skeptical about this content that's used online. How do we use it? How do we analyze it? How do we quote it? And this is what I want to try push you guys, and hopefully through a discussion with everybody, to try and really, through understanding the nature of this content that's being produced online, we can better understand its usage and what we can do with it. So what are academics, filmmakers, activists, professionals, technologists doing with this content, and how do you try to avoid rumor?
I think in an ideal world, we are all collectively responsible. I think with social media, like we said before, it's become a free, open space for anyone to utilize to express their views, their agendas, propaganda. And like you said, it's with mainstream media, with state TV, Syrian state TV, but it even goes beyond that. You have terrorist organizations and militias and perpetrators going public with what they're doing, filming what they're doing, documenting what they're doing, sharing it to help mobilize and recruit people. And then you have people who are just average activists. Some of these activists send out information that's incorrect to further their own agendas. And then you have the people that are there in the middle of it, who are caught in the middle, who are trying to really share the perspective, which is an honest perspective and a clear perspective of what's really happening on the ground. But that's being really it's because of the amount of content that's coming out from all different directions, people are being overwhelmed. And I think that we are all responsible. The content creator may be responsible when he's filming to ensure that he's filming through a perspective that's an ethical perspective, and the person who's uploading it, the person who's retweeting a tweet, make sure that you're doing your research and the person that you're retweeting is someone that's credible and that hasn't, shared any other incorrect information in the past. So there's a lot of responsibility that comes with social media. It's one thing that we teach to our trainees. It's always like, if you're gonna pick up a camera, you need to really understand how the camera works. You need to really understand how to create a story in the most ethical and honest and maintain the integrity of the video. And so I think it goes all ways for the uploaders, the curators, and everyone else. Again, we could leave this open for discussion, because it's still something that we're all...
Because the we are all responsible kind of situation is a little bit scary. Because yes, we are all responsible, but we need to push for more. And maybe we can hear a little bit about verification, media, your work on media verification, and then we can open to the...
Sure. I was going to build on Tim's point and address the issue of context and maybe bring in some of what Zeynep talks about in her piece. The notion of expertise is like we all have proximities to different ideas, to different places, to different people, and our expertise is can be thought of as a function of our proximity. So when I, as a reporter, want to part of it is that there's a flood of information coming in, but it's this notion of the publisher as the citizen journalist as addressable that opens the door to the serious journalism and the important verification, which is the conversational piece. Context comes through conversation. And yes, we need to build different sorts of context. We need to have the contextual understanding of the expert in Cairo. Then we need to have the contextual understanding, the conversation with the person in Copenhagen who understands what the relationship of Egypt to Denmark means, which is not going to be understood by the person in Cairo. But Zeynep talks about the importance. Authentic journalism is conversational now. Authentic journalism involves understanding who you should be speaking with, and dealing with the language mediation issue in whatever way you want to, or whatever way you can, and trying to then understand. And I close with an observation. In conversation earlier this week with a really amazing blogger, Elliot Higgins, who's was unable to be here today, but he said his friend has started or has figured out that the best way to document the jihadist videos coming out of Syria, and there's a friend who's Syrian, is to Facebook friend the jihadists. And he's transparent about who he is. He says, I'm in the UK, I'm a Syrian, I'm doing research on the conflict, will you Facebook friend me? And these jihadists Facebook friend him and say, yeah, I want to tell you what I'm doing, and here's what I believe. And he has conversations with him. They send him images, horrible images, share their, horrible ideas, but this is what investigative journalism, this is what verification looks like. It looks like Facebook friending jihadis, And now the poor guy here is probably going to get his door knocked down because somebody's scraping NSA is opening up Facebook servers, and they're going to come bashing through his door. But that's kind of another problem. It's this conversation through context, I think, is the important, or context through conversation is the important.
There should be 2 mics circulating up. Right here, please.
Hi, I run a Barcamp nonprofit, so I thought I'm going to take the discussion outside a little bit. My name is Sylvia Percy. I come from Poland originally, and I wear a few hats and just wanted to add to this discussion, possibly shift it a little bit. As a social media strategist, I think there's 3 elements of social media by default that we tend to talk about. It's tools, it's content, and people. We have talked about conversations. We have talked about content. And obviously, both of those tools allow us to look at the conversations, check the conversations. They allow us to measure the volume of conversations. In some cases, like in Poland, for example, to judge 2, 3, 4 sides of the story based on the volume. But I think, personally, and this is my personal opinion, and I would like to check if the same happens in Arabic media, I think it boils down to something which is universal and has nothing to do with social media, is people. Is the influential and trusted personalities in every single country, every single community that put a lot of effort in their online presence, and the only possible difference between how social media functions in conversations and engagement and how it functions on offline, or used to function offline, or more traditionally, if we can use the term, is the fact that everyone globally, regardless of language or the tools we have right now for translation, can question those influences. So actually, if I say I'm an influential, I'm going to make it a coffee blogger right now in the country, everyone in this country can question what I say, which means regardless of me being an academic, someone who has a diploma or not, I really need to be open to admit my mistakes. And I think this is something that at least in Eastern European social media we can use as a sign to identify the influential people. Because if we have bloggers in Poland admitting that they are super powerful, they have huge networks of followers, they've made a mistake, and they correct the sources, in that case, me as a journalist or person who's editing this content for Global Voices in English, I can then trust that source more than a source that's going to, say they're a social media guru, they are a guru in particular, they use the words that are forbidden in social media. On the other hand as well, I think in some cases, something we've learned from Cairo, from our friends, you will not know about it from social media unless you know someone personally in that particular country who's trusted, unless you have extensive network of powerful sources. And in some cases, as a journalist, you might not be able to quote them. So how do you deal with that? I think those questions of putting your personal reputation out there on stake are very important right now. When I talk to the blogger lady who's running the Everyday Sexism in London, she's receiving death threats every day. And that's pushing her even harder to admit openly she was the person who started a simple Tumblr blog, which is now changing the way Metropolitan Police are assessing sexual offences in London. There is a risk, but if you subscribe to that risk as an influential person, you're actually having an impact and you're more trusted than celebrities. And we had a lot of reports related to social media where celebrities maybe cause a lot of retweets, but they don't cause action. So I'm really interested in that area of clicktivism as opposed to activism. How do we define the two? And I still think it's a correlation of online and offline, and the three together, tools, conversations, and people. So I would be interested in what you think, what your experiences or case studies from Arabic media, because obviously that's something I'm not as familiar as you are.
Well, the thing is, in the Arabic media, the way they deal with social media is just to get information. And one of the most problematic thing is, for example, how to trust people on the ground. For example, the Syrian conflict again. People would call and they wouldn't give their names, and they would be sending videos, and they would be sharing photos, and they would be sharing information and statistics and stuff. So it's very hard to verify information. The problem that we face also is that there is, like, sometimes we'd be receiving a video and like just a week later we would receive the same video but like longer one that would just it would be the opposite of the like opposite information of the first video, so we would look like liars. And many mainstream Arabic mainstream media fall in this entrapment. Like, we would give information, trust people, because who are the people? They are anonymous sometimes. You know, it's not always that individuals are running social media. Sometimes it's organizations. Sometimes it's like secret services people. They run also social media. Like, for example, the jihadists, the example that you've mentioned. It's a very big question. It's like, who runs this? Like, all Al-Qaeda now is recruiting so many people, especially in Europe, via Facebook and via Twitter. They are recruiting teenagers and sometimes children. Is it an individual who's running it, or it's like an organization who's running it? How do we see the social media? Is it it's just like an information or an object, or I have to deal with it as a person and if having flesh. So it's still problematic. Yeah, it's still problematic in the Arab media, the way we deal with social media, I would say.
That particular situation you're mentioning, the point I'm trying to make is that you have ability to look historically and what happens, and I'm just trying to apply it to myself as a blogger. If I receive a piece of material which is short, it is not in my power, based on all the information, to state otherwise. If a week later I receive a film which is longer, first thing I would do is go to my blog, update my blog post, and say, this is exactly what happens to journalists, and be completely transparent that a week ago, this is what I could tell my audience. Today, I will admit openly, my view will have to change,
Yeah.
360 degrees. And based on this particular act, people will trust me as a source or as a curator, if that makes sense. What I'm trying to say is that we see a lot of individuals in Eastern Europe who build up that type of audience or a tribe, but also that type of reputation. And if they make a mistake at some point, they almost cannot not admit that they failed, because that would completely damage years and years and years of building their reputation. Sometimes not making any money of it, obviously. Sorry.
If I can just jump in to just put a little bit of context in this. So the two ideas that I want to take out of what you were saying, what Liana was saying, is on one side this idea of anonymity and people being able to make comments or speak or contact mainstream media and preserve them being anonymous for security reasons on one side. And then on the other side, this idea of building credibility. And how do you build credibility with an audience if for security reasons you cannot say who you actually are? Or like in most of the cases, with the project we're working on, with the Syrian project, is that when the activists needed to come on mainstream media, they would put masks on, beards, makeup, so that people don't really see them. So I would like to, I'm going to definitely give back the floor to our panelists, but I'd really like to hear from people around what balance between this idea of building credibility that you're talking about, that's extremely important, but also these ideas of security and the importance of being able to stay anonymous when you report on the mess in your country.
Yep. Okay, I'm Dave Hart from here at Birmingham City University, and I actually research community media here in the UK. Firstly, a great opening panel from which I have many questions, particularly actually around very interested in the kind of Western gaze on the things we see coming back. But actually my first question, because I'll probably put my hand up again, sorry, but is actually about verification and the business of verification, actually. Just recently, I think it was the end of last year, Storyful, who are a Dublin-based organisation whose business is verification, bought out by News Corp. So clearly Murdoch is realises the value, the economic value of verification, really. And I think it's just that notion of the role citizens play in the creation of citizen media obviously is very vital, and it's the thing that excites us. But obviously once verified, the media become objects out of which money can be made, and it can be made by a whole host of people, but ultimately it ends up potentially in the hands of multinational media corporations. And I wondered how comfortable we are with that, the idea that maybe the citizen benefit is it's social change, but the economic benefit is felt way over somewhere else, usually and often in the West, with organisations who see the potential to create economic capital from it. And I wonder how that sits with us really as activists and filmmakers and as academics.
I guess I can speak. I'll try to keep my remarks brief, but so I think we're in very early days of all of this, right? I mean, internet, social media. Now, verification. Verification is obviously, Checkdesk, Storyful, There are other projects and regionally, culturally, geographically specific verification efforts. But this bridging to mainstream media, the approach that mainstream media has had to using citizen media is there are two primary components. One is premised on old slave labor models, where this is free content that we're going to get to fill up web pages that we put advertisements alongside, and please, the kind of CNN report, send us your great stuff. We'll put it on CNN. We'll be making money. You'll be doing the work, and it's obviously a flawed model. And secondly is the CNNs of the world looking at crowdsourcing the verification work, and that also a flawed model. So I think that we're in very early days of this. I think that until the web develops a sort of infrastructure like Bitcoin for democratizing micropayments out to the citizens that are collaborating to create content, verify content, translate content, and until we have a web that allows for that sort of passing of value, we're going to continue, crowdsourcing is going to continue to be modern slavery. And unfortunately, that's what we're looking at.
Yeah, I think really, really good question, because that's something that Witness has been trying to, I'm sure Witness and everyone else is really trying to figure out. We partnered with Storyful, actually, and YouTube, and have created this human rights channel on YouTube. And this is basically a platform where we curate videos, Storyful verifies the videos, and we monitor situations globally. And we create playlists that kind of, again, contextualize incidents and events that are happening globally around the world using citizen footage that has been verified. Again, this is in response to what you're talking about. There's so much footage out there. And unfortunately, through my experience with training individuals, for example, within the Syrian context, most of the media activists that are on the front lines and filming and capturing what's happening, a lot of them initially were doing it to share their own stories, but now many of them are freelancing for international media, and a lot of their media, a lot of the content they're collecting is now being dictated by these media outlets. So rather than them just going out to capture what they're seeing, they now have developed this sense of like, all right, CNN, BBC, whatever it may be, this is the type of content they need. And one thing that I was just sharing with the panelists earlier before we started was one of our sessions that we do with a lot of activists is that there was a chemical attack in Aleppo in March of last year. And so this is something that everybody's familiar with, and it was all over the news. And so we brought 5 different video reports from 5 different media outlets from 5 different parts of the world. Clearly, each report had a different agenda, had a different storyline, from Fox News to BBC to Syrian State TV to Syrian Opposition TV, all sorts of different sources. And at the end, what we saw were completely different stories. But the one thing that was consistent was the footage. It was all citizen media footage that was being used to support these stories. So it really, I think, was like an aha moment for the people sitting in the room, where it's like, I'm on the front line capturing this, and I didn't even realize that this is what is happening with my content. So it's a real issue, and I think a lot of it has, I think what we need to do, is moving forward, is really educating one another and sharing and really building and supporting individuals that are doing that.
We're actually we're collecting questions over Twitter, which I'll ask to the panelists now, but also I only had one theme that I also wanted to get into our discussion, and then I'll leave the floor completely open to questions. And it's something that I really wanted to hear Michelle and Sina on. So if we take one step back on exactly the same things we're talking, verification, responsibility, big ethical consideration, huge amount of content that's being put out there with no organization, no tagging, no labeling. And then we've got academics coming and picking up what they like to study and then publishing a lot of papers about them. And then we've got journalists picking up what they like, and they like pieces about it. And I want to think with you just a little bit about video and about film and about documentary. And Sine, so based on your experience working on the act of killing, and Michelle, your experience writing on the act of killing, and all these ideas of graphic images and violence and these things that we briefly spoke about in the beginning, is whose realities and whose collective memory and whose story and whose history. So each one of these documentaries, so if I'm thinking of all the post-Arab uprising documentaries, most of you have heard of The Square, Return to Homs. So there's been a lot of films that were made post-2011 in the Arab world, but the same, Indonesia, Rwanda. If we look at these cultural creations, who is the person, who are the people who are responsible for them, and what stories are they telling, and which realities, and whose realities, and whose money?
I can try, but that was a lot of questions, and I think I
No,
could talk.
It's a discussion.
No,
again,
sure, but I think if I were just to answer a few of them, it would take hours, right? So, but what I can say is that I think there is a misunderstanding in thinking that there is some pure images out there and some pure people out there who are making them, and then there is all the bad stuff. I think anyone who takes up a camera is making a choice, is filming something specific, and does have some sort of idea about what they want to do and put it out there. This Danish old documentary theory guy who said a documentary is reality, but told through a temperament, through a person, a soul. And I think that's the case for all the films that we are making, right? Then, of course, there are big differences between taking up a camera to document an atrocity at a certain moment, basically just to show that this happened, and then to go out and make a film over a long, long time where you're building up a whole argument, and maybe you follow some people over a long period of time, and you want to show their development and so on. There's difference in the time you spend, in the money you have for it, in the whole way of storytelling, and there is a huge difference in the distribution of the final product as well. With the act of killing, it's clearly a story told by a director, a film director, Joshua Oppenheimer, and he's spent 10 years working in Indonesia doing this film and another film that we're bringing out in August about the victims. And you see it in the film because he's asking, you don't see him, but you hear him ask some questions along the way. And but this film is different in the way that it's a documentary, but it's a documentary documenting a process where perpetrators in Indonesia who were involved in some mass killings that happened in 65, 66 are making scenes based on their own experiences, telling about that. And that could, of course, and some people think that's totally ethical flawed, because why are you giving these people a platform to talk about their things? Our reasons for doing that is that we think it's very important, and documentary has a long tradition to do films about survivors. That's, of course, very important. But survivors can talk about the experiences they've had. If we want to understand how perpetrators think, we have to talk to them. We have to understand their images inside their heads. And the method that Josh used in doing the act of killing, I believe were very, very good methods to bring out the imaginations of the perpetrators. What did they think they were doing? What did they think about their victims? How did they see the society they were part of? All of that is sort of in in this film. It's a long film, and it's been a long process making it. So this is a very short explanation about that. But that's very important. Another important thing is that film is exactly not a historical film. It's not a film that's trying to say this is exactly what happened. I hope that those films will be made in Indonesia by international directors and by Indonesian directors alike. I hope those films will be made. But this is not what The Act of Killing is doing. The Act of Killing is a piece that's trying to show what is the struggle about the interpretation of these events in Indonesia. What has been the majority dominant discourse in Indonesia, and why has that majority dominant discourse had such a strong impact for such a long time? That's what it's trying to show, and it's trying to show it both through the personal story of Anwar Congo, who was one of the perpetrators, and what happens to him when he goes through making all these recreations of his experiences in a broad sense. Experiences meaning both what he actually did, but also his nightmares about what he did, his different experiences. And then it's also trying to show on a political level how Anwar Congo was, in a way, at the bottom of a very, very violent structure where he was one of the people killing together with Adi, one of the other characters, but there were also a newspaper editor who was giving the orders at the time. There were also generals, there were also military, there were also other people on this whole pyramid. So that's the ambition of the filmmakers, to try and expose these kind of things through these special methods. Whether we succeeded or not is up to the audience to determine.
I think The Act of Killing is an absolutely fascinating film and an important film. And I think that it's fascinating and important, actually, for many of as well as what you've said, for certainly those reasons, but it's fascinating and important because of how it has entered into the film industry and how it has been used. And in many ways, it raises exactly the kinds of problems that are coming up, exactly the kinds of problems that are all about the Western gaze or the Western market, the need for a kind of satisfying historical educational document to exist for an audience to react to feel about, and then to either berate themselves for their lack of noticing before, or to kind of well up and praise. And sort of for me, one of the major problems of the film is how it was received and how it was lauded, and how that kind of praise masks actually what I think are very much the very respectable goals of what was going into, and the time and the energy and the effort and the commitment that went into that project. And unfortunately, much of what I actually have called wanking that's going on around that film sort of turns it into pornography. That wasn't its intent, and I have a great deal of respect for the project, and certainly for the larger project that it exists within. But the way in which it has been used raises really important questions and really worrying questions. The one other thing I kept thinking about with these discussions that were going on, and I was thinking about the revolutionary use of film technology back in the 60s, 70s, and discussions around third cinema. And one of the key issues was the idea that revolutionary film, we'll call it from then, needed to involve risk. And certainly I think Fanon talking about uprising and protest and revolution talked about the passive bystanders needed to become actors, and he was talking about audiences, and he was talking about the people, but he was also obviously talking about the creators. And I think those kinds of ideas become so fascinating when we have this sense of Arab media and the inability, because risk isn't how the Western audience might think of risk, perhaps. It actually involves something very different, and that's what you're raising. But at the same time, that sense of risk, in terms of not just the filmmakers, but I think we also need to think about that as being risk, being something that citizen spectators need to be engaged in. That's part of an ethical relationship to watching, even no matter who we are, no matter how old we are, no matter how comfortable or privileged our lives. We need to sort of see risk as being a really important element of any spectatorship. And of course, the dominant models are precisely about removing that risk. And I think the idea of a YouTube human rights channel is a long way. It's getting a very long way away from the riskiness of being exposed to those kinds of images, but fascinating the way it's all going.
Can I have a very generic question? Do you think, and if yes, then how, is social media changing culture of civic engagement all across the globe? I mean, generally people getting involved in causes or getting involved, just to follow up on your thought, in participating, listening, consuming content, if not responding or resharing.
We had the Gil Scott Heron, "The revolution will not be televised." I don't know whether you know the song or the rap, but that's about the fact that television is preoccupied by unimportant things, because the next line, of course, is "The revolution will not be televised, it'll be live." That's the end of the piece. And there is a sense, isn't there, in which our engagement with media distracts us from the real world and actually disengages us. And there's a popular little discourse at the moment that, we've all come here together to have a conversation and we're all on our machines. When I go out with my mum, she absolutely hates the fact that I have my phone there. And I try and explain, no, there's other people with us, and I'm as interested in what they're saying as what you're saying. She's not convinced by that at all. And my daughter refuses to participate in this world completely. She's 18, and for her, it's something that old people do, along with playing their music too loud in their bedrooms. And there is a really important question about that. Are we actually stopping participating with real people because we're engaged in a fantasy world of and most of Twitter and Facebook is about inconsequential and unimportant things, but it does create real communities, and I think if you make an effort, they can be just as good as a conversation. A conversation can be just as bland and as uninteresting and unhelpful. But I mean, the thing I was trying to say before is you shouldn't just be talking about it. That's what we do in institutions like this. We talk about it, we write about it, we read about it constantly. The question is, how does that lead to some sort of action, and what is that action? And what can you do as an individual? I think the danger of so much stuff is that we feel less powerful. The fact that when there were a few messages to get angry about in the world, if it felt in the modernist world that I grew up, that there were fewer things to be mad about, and you could focus your attention on them. There seems to be so much in the world to be mad about now. It's another atrocity. It's another oppressive regime not letting its people share. And it can be disempowering. I don't think there is any simple action, and it's about political agendas, and it's about what's important. And I think it's about that old tradition of the avant-garde, and I think maybe, Michelle, you were hinting at this. It's when things are risky and they're not a formula and they make us think, and it doesn't quite come out like we expected it, that it's important. And perhaps the revolution could be televised, but we'd have to actually discuss what that actually meant.
Well, I think two things. When we talk about mainstream media, and right here in this room, we just decide, okay, that's totally crap, and we don't want to deal with it. But at the same time, a lot of people, I think in Denmark, it's most people spend about 3 hours every day watching television still. Okay, so television somehow has the attention of a lot of people. And So when I try to do films, because I think the subjects I'm working on are important and I want the population to see it and I want them to hear about this, I try to get my foot in the door of the public service television stations where this is still possible. Because then I get an audience. And I can't say that all those audiences will actually clearly engage. But it's the only way I know of to get enough attention that those of them who will engage get a chance to see it. And so working, I think I usually say I don't do television series, and I'm definitely not the most wanted producer when you walk into Danish radio. I mean, they would rather see the back of me than invite me in, because the kind of things I do are not the stuff that they can put on prime time and have great, fantastic audience figures. But I do need them in order to get to the audience. So I do engage with them. And I do it despite of a lot of the things that they're broadcasting. But I also do it because I think that we need to communicate wider. And if I only made my films for a small group of friends who agreed with me, then that wouldn't move very many people, and then the social change I'm trying to do would be harder, I believe. So it's a very, very complicated relationship. We have the main, and if we left the mainstream media purely to those who think great, fantastic entertainment, that's what we want. I mean, then all these people spending 3 hours a day, that's also all they would get from that television. So we can hate them and so on, and think that it's problematic, a lot of the stuff that's being done. But what's the alternative?
Okay, so I think that, we rely on social media so much to inform us, to inform one another, to mobilize, to get people to participate. But I think what I would want to ask everyone here also is how social media tends to, or does most of the time, isolate and marginalize the offline community. And the offline community are the parts of the world that are most hit, that are facing the most human rights abuses, are the areas and locations of impact. And so if there's an online discourse, I would assume that this online discourse is really being led by those who are online and have access to that. But then the millions that are out there that lack that, and that are the actual victims, and the ones who are facing what's happening, are the ones that are missing this opportunity to really share their stories in a more widespread way. So I think that's just one thing that I think we should consider.
I mean, when I raise the question of responsibility and curation, what's underlying as well is who makes sure that actually everybody is heard. But again, I mean, hopefully in the afternoon session, we'll have the opportunity to develop more on these questions. Siobhan?
I just wanted to, thank you. It's kind of a response to that, and also to pick up on something that Sylvia said about the idea of people, A, who don't have access to online, and B, the idea of getting an online community, or the influential people who drive that community to take that offline and turn it into action or practice. The areas I'm interested in are around community radio. So obviously I consider the people who don't sit on Twitter and don't do all of those things. And it strikes me that there's a balance to be had. And it kind of speaks to what Sini said as well about people who can be influential in those situations need to speak 2 languages. And I don't mean be bilingual, but I mean speak a language to people to policymakers and to the larger media outlets and the people who can get this stuff, who can change situations, but also get the message out to people who can't access it online. But also you need to speak another language to the people who aren't online and who will be involved in the action. And for me, that language is around encouragement. There's a lot of people that are excluded from discussions because they don't speak in academic terms. They don't consider, and this is no disrespect to Dave, but they don't consider the Western gaze. They don't consider, they don't reflect on it in those terms, but they understand their own real experience and what's happening for them. And it's almost, speak another language to the people who... Oh, that's freaky. Who's that very intelligent person there?
Your voice going out of two different places at the same time.
That's a bit too technical for me. But I do think we exclude people from discussions. That's the main point. And I think we need to consider the language, particularly as academics, that we use. Because, yes, there's a time and a place for using academic language, but don't forget the people who don't, because they might not, they understand what you're saying and they can be a huge part of the discussion, but they don't use the same terminology, and it's important not to exclude them or isolate them by always speaking one language. I think that was the point. 2 languages are important for people in influential positions.
Okay, thanks. Hi, my name's Julie Couples. I'm at the University of Edinburgh. I just want to pick up on the point made by Tim and the kind of Gil Scott-Heron notion of the revolution won't be televised. I think we have to kind of, when we're thinking about the relationship between social media, alternative media and mainstream media, we have to think about the dynamics of convergence. And so we've got this project that is really looking at the convergent activities that surround television in particular. And even if you look, way back before we had YouTube and Twitter and Facebook, one of the points that John Fisk made was that even commercial television, in order to be successful, in order to sell, has to resonate at some level with ordinary people. So in a Gramscian term, it can't just reproduce the common sense, it has to resonate with people's good sense. And so I think one of the things that is happening, and it can, it might not happen very quickly, so it can be very frustrating, but I think one of the things we can see is content crosses media platforms now. And so now one of the things we've done recently is looked at the ways in which the kind of activism around Hurricane Katrina is now making its way into mainstream media. So, as well as celebrating the Katrina bloggers and all the stuff that happened on social media, you can find these alternative discourses now circulating in TV drama and reality TV. And so one of the things I think is really important is to chart these kind of dynamics and how these discourses move across different media platforms.
That's a very interesting point. I mean, maybe we should, again, just because we're running just a little bit out of time, I'm just going to read 2 questions that were also asked on Twitter, and then I'll let our panelists pick up the ones you want. And again, I think this idea of media convergence is extremely important. It was sort of brought up when, Sine, you spoke about mainstream versus social media, but also cross-linking on different websites and cross-publishing on different mainstream media outlets. And again, us as academics and journalists, we constantly need to trace back the origin so that we can verify and so that we can make sure we are publishing the right information. So the idea of convergence is definitely something that is worth probably suggesting maybe a session in the afternoon about. But I'll read these 2 questions that came up on Twitter and then let you guys pick up the ones you want. So an interesting question has to do with the online, offline, so it sort of relinks to what you were saying, Tim, is are revolutions, whatever that means, are revolutions organized privately and offline before going public and on video? And when does a mass movement get traction? And how can we point? Is there a point, a tipping point that we can say a social movement got traction at some point? And the other question is, how do we recalibrate our understanding of the political power of social media given the Arab experience? So if we want to learn from whatever happened during the Arab uprising, is how does this allows us to better understand and assess the political power of social media? Did I get it right, George? Yes. Okay. Okay.
Hi.
Or you guys could pick up answers, by the way. It doesn't have to be us.
I'd like to share another anecdote, I guess. Just to link the offline versus online and how that impacted the revolution in Yemen. Yemen is one of the most impoverished countries in the Middle East. And people are living on $2 a day, and nobody could really afford a laptop or a computer or anything like that. And so the people who were really, the movement that started in Yemen was mostly a grassroots, on-the-ground, offline movement. But what happened was that people were watching the images of the Arab Spring in Yemen and really inspired by it, but that didn't really spark the revolution in Yemen. What sparked it was, of course, an attack on the square on one Friday. They call it Jum'at al-Karama, which is the Friday of Pride. Yeah. And so what happened was there were probably around a handful, I could count them on my two hands, of people who were actually tweeting and talking about this. And as the movement exploded in Yemen, no one really knew about it, and no one was really talking about it. I remember being I was back in New York City and just watching the news, and all I saw was just images of Egypt, of Syria, of Tunisia, and yet there was a massive movement mobilizing in Yemen, and no one had any idea, no one was talking about it. And that was one of the things that inspired me to quit my job and just fly over there with my camera, because I felt like, number one, there was the issue of language. Most people don't speak English, so they can't communicate with people in the international community. Second thing is not everybody has access to the internet, and most people can't afford it. So what I saw there was an offline, on-the-ground movement, people going back to the basics of passing out leaflets, going from neighborhood to neighborhood, mobilizing teams to bring people to the square. And it was pretty incredible to see that kind of impact. And the role of social media in that movement basically came later, and it was always, I was surprised to see, I'm not a journalist. I picked up a camera for the first time when I went to Yemen. I was like, my hobby was photography. And I could not believe how the media had reached out to me, because I was one of the very few people who spoke two languages and had access to the square, was collecting footage, was collecting content. So I think what social media does is it's kind of revolutionized citizen journalism, the role of individuals within these movements. But at the same time, I think that there's still something to say about the offline, process and how people mobilize.
Hi, it was myself, Peter Sharples, who made the point about the offline process that was initially mentioned. What I was actually referring to was in places like Egypt, people actually initially communicated via closed networks like BlackBerry Messenger, and it was kind of that hidden side of things, that one-to-one conversation that actually organised these mass movements. And then when people realised there was a mass movement, then suddenly it moved over from being a thing about groups and individuals into an actual mass occupation that then was videoed, that then was shared via social networks, and then ultimately went global. So it's kind of taking the whole process of hyperlocal to community to national to international.
It's easy to get preoccupied by the technology. There's a level at which it works simply, isn't it? And it's I'll stand up if you do. It's that moment in which you do something quite brave, and it's easier to do it if there are other people, and the technology in which you take that step and you do it in solidarity doesn't depend on any one technology, closed or open, electronic, local or global. It's more about that commitment. The second thing is, I think, in your account, what's really important is actually physical geography and symbols, because sometimes people stand up when something symbolic happens. People stand up when a piece of territory that is important to them feels to be under threat. But there is something important about the technology, I think, I remember when I started in community video, we managed to have one Sony reel-to-reel machine, and it sometimes worked. It sometimes recorded what we wanted and was important to us, but that is an entirely different thing. You do have to have a degree of wealth and live in a place with an infrastructure to do it. But for hundreds and thousands of us to have the equivalent or even the better machine than that Sony reel-to-reel and can take it with us is an enormous change. But actually what we do is exactly the same thing. We take the moment to stand up. We take the images of the geography and the places that matter to us. We do things which are about symbolism. So that isn't a resolution, but it seems to me the principles that are underlying all those events. And just to take the point about closed and open networks, of course, you may be aware that in Britain there was an enormous panic about the use of closed networks for trouble on the streets that seemed to be to do more with violence and attacks on commercial premises and stealing, and so I don't know whether there ever will be closed and open networks when police and the state want to know what we're doing.
We're going to take a couple of questions that we grouped from Twitter.
Yeah. Hello. So from Twitter we have some questions and one comment. One question is about how can we differentiate between collectivism and activism? A question on verification, another one on verification. How do we verify citizen content? Could we learn from LinkedIn endorsement? A couple of questions on credibility. One is, does correction raises the credibility of the individual if someone published something and then corrected it? And the other question is, how do we build credibility when many users choose to remain anonymous? Should I mention the comment? Sure. Yeah, so it's a comment from Mona Al-Masri. She's Egyptian and she lives in the UK. She's commenting on the digital divide, saying that technology connected us to other people who are like-minded and helped us to build new circles for ourselves too. Thank you.
I think the questions around anonymity and credibility have been relatively covered. So maybe if people want to develop these things more, maybe we can do them in the afternoon session. But some interesting discussion I was having with Rami yesterday over Twitter. I'd like to hear what, Liana, you have to say about. Sure, he's been listening.
Okay.
So if anybody has any questions,
I'm wondering if he wants to make remarks.
Sure. Something he told me yesterday, maybe it's something that he can comment on, is we're talking at like 2 a.m. and coming up with a plan, last-minute plan for this. So we Skype you in at that moment, and then, we put the UK Border Agency handle and that kind of stuff. And he said in Arabic, and I feel like I want to say it in Arabic, and then I'll translate it. He said, "El passport عكس الإنترنت." We were talking about the importance of social media, and what he said in Arabic is the passport is the opposite of the internet, which actually means, so building on this idea that Noha, somebody brought on, and we are all like-minded people, but there's so much exclusion around that. So at the end of the day, the people who we were able to bring into this room are people who, foreign policy, etc., decided that they can be in this room. So without being very activism question, etc., is how can we go beyond these questions about credibility and tools to see there is obviously a citizen reporting narrative or discourse, but on the other side there is this dark side of social media and dark side of the internet where there is a lot of exclusion. The idea of a digital divide has been also asked on Twitter. Maybe Rami, you would like to comment on this idea about passport access internet, which I really liked from yesterday.
Actually, I want to mention for one idea, which is the censorship, which is, I think it's very important that because of it, we created the citizen journalist and social media as a tool.
even the mobile that you raised up just like a few seconds ago, it's enough reason in my country to raise up your mobile to get shot by a sniper. So I mean, like the censorship, it's also very important reason to create this social media network activism, citizen journalists, and in the other way, like the authorities who is controlling this, even the dictatorship in Syria, or the dictator in Syria, or the other authority as the UK border agency. So they are trying to limit our networking, actually, and this is our goal, to network.
Well, it seems to me like this question is very, very relevant, because it seems to me that in the whole discussion this morning, we've been kind of ignoring one side of social media. We keep on talking about social media as a medium to inform people outside of what's going on, and not as an organizing tool, or as like for logistic-wise for the community itself to organize, like we have a demonstration at that time, at that place, let's be there, or to inform each other, like don't go through that street because there's a checkpoint, you might. And we've been kind of ignoring this side of social media. That's not only to inform and to fact check and to know what's going on, but it really also creates a community in a way who are like-minded, who are behind the same goal, but also to organize. And that it's also a tool for the community itself to reach its goals. And it's not only meant for getting the word outside. It's also to inform each other, to know where your cousin is, or to know if everybody is safe or not. So it is also this type of tool that we have not been talking about at all, I feel. And here also comes, of course, the issue of security. Because I think, well, in Syria you have the electronic army that is really, really active on shutting down. In Turkey, in Erdogan, he wanted to stop Twitter. It's not because, mainly, I think, of course, and that he doesn't want the pictures to go abroad, but it's also to stop people from talking to each other. And then, like, how do we deal with that also security-wise? Like, how do we make sure, like anonymity, not only so that they aren't targeted because they talk about what's going on, that they can keep on communicating among each other, and that they keep the revolution going on, that they keep on going. So that's maybe something we should discuss as well. Thank you.
I totally agree with you that, of course, like social media, it has two ways of using it. It's like to speak to the world and building communities within. And I would like to add on what you've just said is also the campaigning that Twitter or Facebook usually does. For example, sometimes we just see like a whole community posting a profile picture against something or pro something, and it's just contagious. It's like people would take it, and the mainstream would take it, and here I would like to raise a question: who is behind it? Which community? Like how can we generate a campaign on social media, and what is the it can have dangerous effects, because Rami just mentioned the dictatorship, and I think there is also a dictatorship within the social media, because it's the community in itself. If I don't agree with you or you don't agree with me, I would block you, or I would ruin your reputation also on social media. So to what extent actually we can really deal with social media? And I think the word credibility and social media, for me, for instance, when social media is mentioned, the word credibility is erased. Like the doubt, it's like I always bring doubts about it. And even in the news, if we want to speak about to speak about a piece of information, and the only source is social media, the fact that we say it's based on social media resources, it brings down the credibility.
It's because you spend too much time in mainstream, I think. Just to jump on this idea of social media and organization aid, it was one of the main themes that I wanted to have part of this Unconference. So hopefully I will again encourage you for a session. We've got Evronia here, who's, I'm sorry about the lights completely going to her, but she's one of the people who were organizing humanitarian relief through online media during the uprising in Egypt, mostly in the second part of it in Alexandria. So we had interviews with a lot of people who were managing accounts like Tahrir Needs and Tahrir Supplies during the uprising in Egypt, and the role of social media in organizing field aid was extremely interesting to us. And there's this like wave among scholars, academics, to sort of look at these two tenses. So there's something there is an immediate need on the ground for something, and then there's the time of media, which runs of social media, which runs at a completely different pace. So that's definitely an idea that worth to be developed further. Organization aid, whether in post-war, post-conflict, post-natural disaster countries. So definitely I encourage anybody interested in this to suggest a session in the afternoon about it. Maybe we should take one or two last questions, and we should break over lunch to start suggestion sessions for the afternoon.
Thanks very much. I have a microphone actually. It's a question really for Rami. So, and it's an expansion of the question of thinking about how we recalibrate our understanding of the political impact of social media. Obviously, in the early days of the uprisings, revolutions, there was a great aspirations for the potential of these new tools and their role, the role they could play. And clearly, in those early days of the revolutions, there was a common evolution in each of those countries, whereby it became about inhabiting and collecting in public space, crucially. And going back to 2006, I saw very clearly the extent to which state security in Egypt really worked very hard to remove people from public space who were organizing politically. So this idea of taking control of public space, and the mirror of that in the social digital space, of your voice being active and being able to collect and organize, being a very, very interesting mirror to that early movement of the revolutions. And the question is why with these new tools and the Arab revolutions being a key site for the most extraordinary exploration of the potential of those tools, why has there not been more change? Why is the direction of change leading in the other direction, it seems, towards more authoritarianism? Why, when in Syria, perhaps one of the most videoed crises of all time, has the international response been so weak? So maybe just as something to slightly ask a more probing question of the potential of these tools.
Did you hear it, or do you need me to say it? Are you still listening to the question? Okay.
Why is the direction of change leading?
No,
A delay.
Turn off the live stream. Don't listen from the live stream.
Perhaps one of the most videoed
Brett. What do I do now?
to slightly as you see that the sound is delayed, like I have to hear it after 30 seconds. So Dima, can you please...
So basically the question comes down to, at a time where... Yes.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Sometimes, actually. On the Skype, no. I can hear you by the...
Don't hear me on the stream. Hear me on Skype.
I'm sorry. I cannot hear you.
Okay. Turn off the stream. Sorry. Where?
Can hear you.
This is why it didn't work.
Can I just try to answer the question? Yes. Please do that, Mina.
Yes, no.
Okay. Rami, did you get the question? Okay. I think it's the audience. Whose audience we're sharing these videos with. The Syrian example is very tough because it's very old. Like most of the images are bloody images, and I think the fact that sometimes there's no distance between the citizen journalist and the event itself, sometimes it would show also some maybe like irrespect to the situation. For example, if we are having dead bodies on the ground and we bring our cameras and we just keep on filming, thinking that this would
if when we just send it to the outside world, people will get outrageous against the regime's atrocities. But sometimes it actually brings different reaction against the citizen journalists themselves. Another thing about Syrian citizen journalists, because like all Syrians are media activists. The activism started as media activism. It didn't start as anything else. It's those who were on the ground, they were filming, they were sending videos, and then they evoluted, because there is also the life of the citizen journalist in a way. He started as someone who documents, then an eyewitness, then filming, and then being recruited. What we were talking about today with Raja is, if you have a camera in Syria, you have a job now. And it's been like also a year or 2 years ago, it's been in the same situation. What do I mean by this? Because mainstream media at some point, they wanted to just focus on battles. And they just wanted videos about battles. So they needed people to film these battles. So citizen activists, they turned their cameras from filming demonstrations or field hospitals to just keep on filming battles. And then we reached a second phase of the Syrian conflict. It became like a civil war. We're just talking about battles, and then only about Islamized people, Al Qaeda, foreigners coming to fight there. So you have this, and also you have people who are giving money to some katiba in Syria, and they want evidence that their money is going somewhere. So they need a proof, for example, they need a proof that a battle is taking place. So in a way, I think citizen journalism in Syria is related also to the militarized battle and to mainstream media and to foreign money. Just last example, one of our characters that we're covering his story, he puts Al Qaeda flag on his head. Does he believe in Al Qaeda? No, but it's just because he needs to be filmed like this. So the money that is coming to his katiba would keep on going, would keep on coming. See what I mean? So it's like the image, and it's one of the most really difficult thing that we're facing now, which reflects a failure also, is that the way people were represented in the Syrian TV, it became the reality on the ground now. So in a way, if we want just to track back the history of the propaganda of the Syrian regime, now it's like the reality of today. It's not even propaganda, you know. Yeah, I think just to add on what she's saying, these very images that she's talking about, again, they are impacting and influencing the realities on the ground and changing what's really happening on the ground. But it's also what's really, again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, dictating how the international community decides to intervene, whether they do or they don't. There's, again, way too many videos out there, and I spoke to, there are several investigators that I know that talked about sifting through over 10,000 videos just to see if they could use anything and potentially, you know, to add into their case file for the future. And it turned out only 2 of them were actually viable and could possibly support the investigative process out of over 10,000 videos. So there's so many videos out there, but there's still not enough content that really documents in a more very objective and ethical way. There are way too many videos that we're seeing right now because people are living in a conflict. They're lacking basic necessities. So I have to, and again, it goes back to who's funding what. A lot of the people who are being funded are the individuals who aren't looking to spotlight these stories and the information the international community needs to really take action. A lot of what's out there is very crime-based. We all know that there are crimes happening thanks to these videos. We all know that innocent lives are being taken. It's a humanitarian crisis. The world, when it comes to awareness, check. We get that. There are inconsistencies, there is misinformation, but we could all agree that innocent lives are being taken. What we don't know yet is who are the ones committing the crimes. Are they the terrorists? Are they the brigade? Is it the opposition? Is it the government? And that's the one piece that that we've kind of neglected because of the fact that we're so focused on the crimes, so focused on the graphic imagery, because that's what we think is going to make an impact. But what we really need to look at right now and really learn from the conflict in Syria is how can we begin to link these crimes and what we're seeing on video, what we're hearing on social media, all these different sources that make up a case, that make up some sort of real action, can prompt that. What is it that we need to do to really get there? And why? When are we going to shift from that?
I just thought I would share a small story about a film that we are co-producing right now. It's called Night Will Fall, and it's a British film, but it's basically about the when the concentration camps in Europe at the end of the Second World War, when they were opened, and how people were filming there, and these people who filmed in those places, they were on the front line because they were propaganda units from the military, from the UK military, from the US military, from the Russian military. So they had been filming the war, and they had mainly been filming brave soldiers on tanks and stuff like that, and were told not to film any soldier who got killed or any civilian who were hurt or anything like that. They were filming stuff to be shown home in the US, for example, in cinemas to say, you know, this is great, we're doing a great job in the war. And then when they entered these camps, they realized we have to document this, because if we don't document this at this very moment, the German people who had been involved and who had sometimes lived right next to the camp and been able to run a more or less completely ordinary life, they would say this didn't happen. When the bodies had been buried, when everything was over, they could say that. And all of a sudden these cameramen on the ground had to realize, how do we film that this is right in front of our eyes? And one of the things they did was that they filmed both the dead bodies, and the German people from the villages were ordered to come and see, so that they could film both the people who were killed and the people from the neighborhood, the mayor, the police chief, all the people in authority. And they especially did long shots where you couldn't cut. You just had to shoot. And at that time they were shooting 10-minute rolls, so it was tough. But they were trying to shoot a 10-minute roll in one long shot of this is what's happening. And it says something about how you also, when you have the camera available and you're trying to film atrocities, and how you have to think in terms of what it is that you're shooting and what you're shooting it for. And how you have to not just film the person who was killed, but the relationship between the person who's killed and what's going on around at the same time. I mean, that's just one small thing, but I thought it was a revelation for me seeing those images.
What I want to suggest is that, again, the different things that we discussed in this panel, we definitely couldn't answer completely any of the very important questions that were raised, and there are some others on Twitter that we couldn't take. But again, let's all look at the different themes that were raised this morning as sort of entries to the afternoon sessions. So we're going to go out for lunch, I mean, as in go out of this room, outside to have lunch together. During lunch, we would be inviting people to suggest sessions on the whiteboard. The last thing I just wanted to say is a sentence I always say to my students or anybody I'm working with, is that the French people were given 100 years to do their revolution. So it's taking the Arab world just a little bit more time, and it's just part of the process. I feel like we need to keep reminding people that democratization and people understanding media literacy is a long process and has to be. So I don't really agree that the tools haven't really done their job yet. I think what Ed you were saying, we're just at the beginning. So just let's take a deep breath. It's going to be a long ride, but I really hope we're going somewhere better.
And can I just add one more comment for a little bit of optimism? Because I feel like we're going down. I totally agree with both of you. Syria is a perfect case study. It's one of the first conflicts that has begun to investigate crimes and document because of the technologies that are available right now during the conflict. If you look at Yugoslavia, if you look at just all sorts of crimes and atrocities that have happened in the past, you had investigators going in way after the conflicts were over, having to go dig and search for this information. But now we have people who are doing it as it's happening. So technology is supporting a lot of important, crucial work.
We're getting there.